Hey friend, welcome back to the Sage Audio channel. Today we're going to be answering the question, what is mastering for vinyl? Now we'll also be answering whether or not you actually need a separate master for cutting vinyl records. We'll be looking at the physical limitations of the vinyl record as well as the lathe used to cut the vinyl record and how all this information combines to give a clear answer as to whether or not you do need that separate master. So stick around for the full video. I think you'll enjoy it. But before we get started, if you are an artist or an engineer and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample in return. So to answer the latter question a bit quickly, yes, you do need a separate master for vinyl. Now, of course, this isn't all the time. If you do have a master that was made for digital and it can accommodate a vinyl record, then that should be fine. But what most likely will happen is that since the mediums are so different in terms of the frequencies they can handle and how they just essentially operate, you will need a separate master, otherwise you're going to lead to various problems. So let me just go over the problems that can occur and will most likely occur if you do not have a separate master for vinyl. So the first will be varying degrees of distortion. So let me explain this. As you can see, I got a little demonstration here using a Waves plugin. And what you can see is that, a record is a physical disc. So it has to work with some of the laws of physics. So you see that there is a circumference around the outside, and this is a larger circumference than the circumference on the inside. Now, since the record is spinning at a constant rate, the needle is going to cover a greater distance along the outside than it will on the inside of the record. So as the needle moves slowly towards the inside, it's losing space. It's going at a slower velocity because it has less of a circumference. So on the outside, it's going at about 20 inches per second. On the inside, it's going at about 8.5 inches per second, around that roughly. So what does this do? Well, essentially, it's the same thing as if you took your tape machine and you went from 15 inches per second to about 7.5 inches per second, or maybe 3 3/4 inches per second. What that's going to do is attenuate the high end. Another example of this would be if you were to take a 96 kilohertz file and take that sampling rate and have the computer read it at 44.1 or maybe 22.05. Essentially, it's going to degrade the high end. And that's exactly what happens in a vinyl record. No matter what record, to varying degrees based on the size and the speed of the rotation, but on a 33 1/3 rotation vinyl record, on a full-size LP, by the time it gets to the center of the record, the high end, or about 15 kilohertz, has been attenuated by about 3 decibels. So that's pretty significant. Now, what this means in terms of distortion is that because there is a slower velocity on the inside and it's harder to replicate high frequencies, if those frequencies are very present in the file or the master that's being used to cut the vinyl record, by the time it gets to the center, the needle is going to work harder in order to generate those frequencies. It's going to have to, vibrate a lot quicker. And what that might cause, and will most likely cause if the high end is excessive, it'll cause distortion. The needle will kind of jump, it'll kick, it'll cause hissing. It's going to cause a lot of distortion on your record. So if you have a digital record, and this isn't something that you had to think about because the digital medium is completely different, you don't have this physical limitation, you don't have excessive high end causing a problem, you're not going to necessarily think about it. Especially think about genres like hip hop. It's completely characterized on the high end that's generated via the hi-hat or the crispness or the sibilance of the vocal. That's definitely part of how those songs are mixed. So if an album like that was to be used for a vinyl master, it's going to cause a lot of distortion and it's not going to sound good. So this is the first problem that you can run into if you use your digital master for vinyl record cutting. So, problems 2 and 3 with using a digital master in the vinyl cutting process are kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're different from one another, but they're very related. They both have to do with dynamics. So, let me explain that now at the same time. So, in a physical cutting process, when you have a signal that's very dynamic and goes from not too intense to very intense quickly, essentially what's going to happen is the needle is going to cut down laterally. Now, if the needle cuts down laterally enough, in the future during playback, any needle that's dragged across that huge gap is going to skip and it's going to jump out of place. So this is actually a problem that happens a lot, especially with consumer products. If the needle isn't weighted properly or it's not heavy enough, it will jump out of place and you will skip to a different section of the record or a different song. If you've ever seen a vinyl record and you see the grooves on it, you'll know that the needle essentially needs to stay in the grooves in order to play the song, cohesively. Now, the second problem has to do with brick wall limiting. So let's say you have an instance in which the song is, barely dynamic at all, but it's incredibly loud. So this is something that happens a lot in a digital master. Something gets brick wall limited so that the overall integrated LUFS can be loud enough or loud enough to the artist's, specifications or what they elect to have. And in turn, you have just a really hot record. Now, that can work for a digital recording. It really doesn't work too well in the physical limitations of both the lathe and the record itself. So when you have a blaringly loud signal, one that's really, really hot, it's going to overwhelm the needle and it's going to cut the record in a way that causes distortion. So again, if you can imagine in a digital recording, there's 144 decibels of dynamic range. In a vinyl record, not so much. So for the first problem, if you go from really loud to really quiet or vice versa, again, you're going to cause that lateral dip and you're going to have a situation which the needle jumps out of place. If you use brick wall limiting and you make your signal incredibly loud, you're going to overwhelm the needle and that's going to cause a lot of distortion during the record cutting process. So these are problems 2 and 3 with using a digital master during the vinyl cutting process. So the last problem I'm going to talk about has a lot to do with everything we just discussed, but it's a little bit different. Essentially, any consumer that has maybe $100, maybe a $200 turntable or something of that quality is going to have all the problems we just talked about, but they're going to be exacerbated by their equipment's inability to replicate intense sounds. So back in the day when the vinyl record was the primary medium for music, record labels and lathe cutting houses or what have you would keep certain standards in mind. There was a name for this standard. It was the RIAA standard, and it was used so that a consumer could listen to a record and the playback would be good. The playback would be something that they could enjoy. There wouldn't be that much distortion. There wouldn't be needle jumping or anything like that. Now, since vinyl is no longer the primary medium for music, the primary medium is digital, these things aren't really thought about anymore. Now, in huge mastering houses where they can cut these records, they have the nicest equipment. I mean, they have the best equipment that you can possibly have for cutting records and for record playback. So these problems aren't really problems for them. For everybody else who spent maybe $200 on an Audio-Technica turntable, these are going to be big problems for you. And you might have noticed if you've ever listened to a record, you're thinking, why is this skipping? This shouldn't be skipping. Or why am I hearing weird distortion or things like that? It's because a lot of these mastering houses are using digital masters to cut their records because for them, it's not a problem. For anybody else, it's a problem. For them, not a problem. So these are things we need to have in mind when making something for a vinyl record. If you want it to sound good across, all platforms, if you want even maybe a $50 turntable to be able to play back your record in a way that's, at least halfway decent, you have to have these standards in mind. And that includes, of course, controlling the dynamics. It includes controlling the sibilance or the high frequency range. And it includes not brick wall limiting so that you don't have distortion, you don't have a jumping needle, and you don't have all the problems that we just discussed. So keeping in mind consumer grade equipment is incredibly important when it comes to deciding the frequency spectrum and the dynamics and the amplitude of the master with which you're going to cut your record. Now, these are just some of the problems that can occur by using a digital master during the vinyl cutting process. This video is in no means comprehensive, and if you're interested in this topic and you want to learn more about it, I would highly recommend reading the blog where we go into greater detail about this topic. If you're watching in YouTube, you can just check below this video during the or in the description where we have a link to our website where you can find more information about this topic and a bunch of different topics on audio related stuff. So check that out for sure. I think that's something that would be definitely beneficial for you. Now, before we go, if you're an artist or an engineer and you have a mix that you need mastered, maybe you're about to send something off for vinyl cutting, who knows, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll happily master it for you and send you a mastered sample in return. But thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't like this video, you can dislike it. If you did, please like it. Also, if you could subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. There is also a comment section where you can leave your thoughts, maybe a recommendation for a future video or blog. And then lastly, again, if you're an artist or an engineer, send us one of your mixes at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample in return. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next video.